Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. Before I start, I want to apologize if it runs a little bit longer than it might usually. I'm going to be covering some aspects of FinTrack. Before your eyes glaze over, let me say, stay with me on this. One of the things that's required for us as real estate practitioners is to have an update, an educational update from time to time on FinTrack. And I think this will apply, if you stay with me, as one of your updates. So we're going somewhere with this because we're talking about politically exposed persons. Let me first of all say that the act that we're concerned about is called the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. And the government organization that monitors that act is FinTrack. And FinTrack is the Financial Transaction and Reporting Analysis Center of Canada. Their job is to catch the bad guys who launder money, use the proceeds of crime, or advance terrorism. The problem is that they're in an ivory tower. So how do they know? How do they catch these guys if they're not feet on the ground actually where the transactions are taking place? Well, what they do is they deputize people who are such as accountants, financial entities, dealers in precious metal, money services businesses, and real estate brokers, salespeople, and developers have all been involuntarily deputized to spot suspicious transactions and report them so FinTrack can act upon them. And we are known as reporting entities. Now let me say that this is really serious business. We can say, well, I'm not looking for a job catching these bad guys. I want to sell real estate. It's how I earn a living. Well, FinTrack doesn't look at it that way. They look at it that it's very serious business to apprehend the people who are doing this, and they hold the reporting entities accountable, very much so. Last week, across my desk, I got a report from FinTrack where they were imposing a monetary penalty on a company called Binance Holding. And they are a finance holding company. And what they did was they got fined $6,002,000. $6,002,000. And I want to point out they weren't involved in money laundering. They weren't involved in any kind of proceeds of crime. They weren't involved in terrorist activities. What they did was they didn't do a thorough enough job apprehending the bad guys, asking the questions, and reporting. And so it was a reporting issue, and they got fined $6 million. And I've seen fines of $1 million, $2 million against some of the major banks, and I've seen them upwards of $100,000 and more to real estate brokerages and real estate salespeople. So we got to be very, very careful in following the rules and paying attention when we're dealing with the public in trading in real estate, because that's one of the ways they like to launder money, as an example. So what we want to look at today, we're going to take a look at, and I'll give you an overview, and then we're going to get some meat on the bones. We're going to look at politically exposed persons. And when we talk about politically exposed persons, we're going to be talking about two categories, domestic and foreign. And then we're going to look at heads of international organizations, and then we're going to look at persons of influence. Let me go back to politically exposed persons. If we're talking domestically about politically exposed persons, we're talking about, for example, the Prime Minister of Canada. He's a politically exposed person. Or it may be Lieutenant Governor. It could go all the way down, though, to the Mayor of Puslinch. Now, does Puslinch have a mayor? I'm not sure. But if they do, he's a politically exposed person. And that creates some challenges for us. I want you to imagine that the Mayor of Puslinch is a single guy. I don't know if he is or not, but let's suppose he is. And let's suppose he's dating a gal he met 2 weeks ago. She now is a person of influence. Let's suppose he also, with a buddy of his from high school, bought a duplex, and they share in the duties looking after this duplex. That particular person now is a person of influence. So you're in real estate, and this young fella comes to you, and he's looking at buying a property from you. You have got to somehow find out that he's a friend of the Mayor of Puslinch and that he's in business with him. And then he becomes a person of influence. You've got to ask the kind of questions and probe to discover that and report it to FinTrack, or at least maintain a report that FinTrack can access. let's take a look on the foreign as opposed to the domestic side. I want to imagine that you've got a young fellow from Japan, and suppose he grew up in Honshu Island, Japan. And suppose he lives in a little coastal town, and his dad is the mayor of that little coastal town. Then he is a person of influence because his dad is a politically exposed person. You need to somehow find that out. In your conversation with him, you need to find out that his dad is the mayor of this little town. And the other thing you need to zero in on then, he's buying a $500,000 house because he wants to go to university and live in that house, and he's putting 20% down. That's $100,000. As soon as you hear the $100,000, you've got to zero in on where the money came from. And how do you find that out? You ask him, and you show it, and you track it, and so on. So we find out that there's some obligations, and we find out some new criteria. This business about tracking politically exposed persons and so on came into effect June the 1st, 2021. And the rationale is this: the access, influence, and control that PEPs and HIOs have can make them vulnerable to corruption and the potential targets of criminals who could exploit their status and use them, knowingly or unknowingly, to carry out money laundering or terrorist activity financing offenses. The family members and close associates of PEPs and HIOs are potential targets as well because they can more easily avoid detection. That's coming from FinTrack. Now, it's interesting when we get into that. Let's talk about family members for a second. And we'll find out about this when I kind of zero down a little bit. But when you're dealing with family members, FinTrack gets very specific. It can be your children. Let's suppose you're divorced. Your ex-wife is still considered a person of influence. And your children, and what about your stepchildren? You marry, and the woman that you marry or the man you marry has children. Are those stepchildren considered family? And as such, do you have to concern yourself with persons of interest? Here's what FinTrack says. If they're stepchildren, they aren't considered family unless you adopt them. And if you adopt them, then they are family and they're considered persons of influence. So it gets pretty convoluted. Stay with me, I'm going to deal with it. And there's some references that you can have, and I'll give you some references at the end of this tape that you can use, because you're never going to remember all this stuff. But let's deal with politically exposed persons who's domestic. Now, if it's a domestic politically exposed person, it applies while they're in office and 5 years after they leave office or 5 years after they're dead. So a person who currently holds or has held within the last 5 years a specific office in or on behalf of the Canadian federal government, a Canadian province or territory, or a Canadian municipal government. We're talking about the Governor General or the Lieutenant Governor. We're talking about members of the Senate, House of Commons, or members of the legislation. We're talking about the Deputy Minister. We're talking about an ambassador or an attaché to the ambassador. We're talking about a military officer if he's at least general or above, presidents of crown corporations, head of government agencies, judges of an appellate court, the leader or president of a political party, and mayor, reeve, or chief officer of a municipality, mayor of Puslinch. That comes under it as far as a domestic person who's a politically exposed person. And so then we go on to foreign politically exposed person, and we find it's very mirrored very much the same. A person who holds or has held one of the following offices or positions in or on behalf of a foreign state. He's the head of the state or government. He's a member of the executive council of government, member of the legislature, deputy minister, ambassador or equivalent, military officer with a rank of general or above, president of a state-owned company or bank, head of government agency, judge of the Supreme Court, leader or president of a political party represented in the legislature. Now these people, these foreign person of a politically exposed person, it's a little bit different than domestic as to how long they're on your radar screen. If they are a politically exposed person, once they become registered as a foreign politically exposed person, they remain a foreign PEP forever. Then we look quickly at head of international organizations, and we're talking about international organizations established by a government of states an institution of the international organization or an international sports organization. And an institution established by an international organization does not have to operate internationally. It can just be in Canada, for example. And a person ceases to be head of an international organization 5 years after they're no longer the head of the organization or 5 years after they've deceased. And then we get into persons of influence. And this is, again, where it gets a bit of a challenge. Persons of influence either over the PEP or over the HIO. Family members, spouse or common law partner, their biological or adoptive children, their mothers or fathers, the mothers and fathers of their spouse or common law party, the children of the mother or father, in other words, their siblings, the ex-spouse or partner of a foreign PEP considered a family member forever, and the ex-spouse or partner of a domestic PEP or HIO only until they cease to be in that position. And then we come up with close associations. And a close association can be a person who is connected to the PEP or HIO for personal or business reasons and could include but not limited to the business partner or who beneficially owns or controlling the business with the PEP or HIO, or in a romantic relationship with a PEP or HIO, that's the girlfriend of the Mara Puslynch, are involved in a financial transaction, that's where they're in partnership in the duplex I shared with you before, serve as a prominent member of the same political party or union, serve as a member of the same board, carry out charitable work closely associated with the PEP or HIO, and they're listed as joint listings on a policy, where one of the holders of that policy is the PEP or HIO. In other words, it's a person in a position to influence or be influenced by the PEP or HIO. Okay, that's a lot to digest. Let me say that how do you track it? How do you keep track? Well, as we've seen, you've got to ask some very specific questions. Once you've asked these questions and ascertained, you're going to use a form called the 634. And the 634 is the politically exposed person / head of international organization checklist or record. And it's a 2-page form. And the first page of the form tells you specifically what to fill in and why. And the second page gives you all the outline of what I've shared with you today as a reference, so you can find out, is this person somebody I need to be concerned with? Is this situation something I need to be concerned with? How long do I need to be concerned? And so on. But serious business. RICO requires us to comply with FINTRAC. FINTRAC requires us to be diligent as a recording entity, and politically exposed people and heads of international organizations is very much on their radar screen. I want to thank you very much for investing your time. I look forward to talking to you again next week.